Welcome everyone. This is another video in this lecture series on the contemporary world. This is lesson number 2, part 1 on the world economics. This is a 3-part series on lesson number 2 on the contemporary world, and we will be discussing very significant topic that would lead us into understanding of how the world economic works, what are the economic regimes that are implemented and is adopted by certain countries worldwide, and what are the implications of these economic platforms and economic regimes into countries and its citizens worldwide. And so, before we go to those particular discussions, we had to learn first what are the different topics that we'll be discussing in this particular 3-part series video in this lesson number 2. Now, we will be talking and discussing about the rich and the poor, neoliberalism, capitalism and socialism, or capitalism versus socialism. We had the world of economic interdependence, and then we will have an analysis on the impact of the pandemic on the economic standpoint of the entire globe. And so we will try to understand how COVID-19 change our perspective of how the economy should work. And that's the reason why we are having online classes, is because we are afraid that the pandemic might annihilate every one of us when we are in the classroom. And so that's the reason why we are here and we are learning a different phase of the word normal. And so we are calling it the new normal, and we will try to understand that one in the next videos in this lesson. Now, before we will go deeper into different terms and terminologies that we have to understand in this particular video and lecture series in lesson number 2, we will try to go back first on what is happening in the world. And let us remember that in the previous discussion, we were talking about the concept that no man is an island and we cannot live in total isolation. And so that's the reason why there is what we call as economic globalization, which refers to the increasing interdependence of world economies as a result of the growing scale of cross-border trade of commodities and services, flow of international capital, and wide and rapid spread of technologies. As you look at the picture that is flashed on your screen at this particular moment, you will see exactly how globalization works, although it is the bad side of globalization in the sense that these particular workers are workers in garment factories in Bangladesh, one of the poorest countries in the world, which is, of course, part of the ASEAN, or Association of Southeast Asian Nations, wherein the Philippines is also part of that. And the reality is there are also factories like this in the Philippines. And this garment industry in Bangladesh makes clothes that are then shipped out to the world. It employs as many as 4 million people, but the average worker earns less in a month than a U.S. worker earns in a single day. The stringent rules and taxation and the increase of the minimum wage in the United States pressured these particular corporations and companies to ship out and outsource labor from third world countries such as Bangladesh and other poor countries in the world. That's a reality and a painful fact that we have to accept as a bad side of globalization. The good side of globalization is that there will be greater competition and lesser prices of goods and other commodities. So globalization might at some point be evil in this particular context, but there are also good side of globalization. The fact that gadgets are shipped all throughout the world, that makes communication easy and makes everything in your life relatively fine to live, it's because of globalization. And so, while it is true that there are evils of globalization, there is also a particular side of globalization upon which we can actually rely upon in making lives better than what it is used to be. And so that is economic globalization. the world is slowly becoming one singular entity wherein it is virtually impossible that any country or person in the world can live in total isolation, because the world is rapidly gearing towards economic interdependence. Now, what causes this movement of globalization? Although in the previous video that you had, probably have watched it already, it was specified that globalization is a new term, yet have been exercised by people in the past, and we can trace back the story of globalization during the Silk Road, wherein China are actually trading with the European countries. In the modern time, globalization is fueled and propelled by an economic perspective called neoliberalism. Now, neoliberalism is a policy model that encompasses both politics and economics, that seeks to transfer the control of economic factors from public sector to the private sector. Many neoliberalism policies enhance working of the free market capitalism and attempt to place limits on government spending, government regulation, and public ownership. What do we mean by public ownership? This is the ownership of the government on specific industries in a particular economy. The government should not interfere into the economy. There should be lesser and lesser regulations from the side of the government, and let the private sector flourish as it is and make progress for the country as a whole. And that is the principle of free market capitalism, wherein there should be no restriction as to trade and industry in a particular geographic location within a particular country and outside of the boundaries of a specific country. Meaning the world has to get in touch with each other without any government intervention, or at least a very limited government intervention. Because guess what? The moment the government touches something, it almost always turns into stones. It's more like a curse on the side of the government, that the moment it participates in the market, or the moment it participates in the economic activities, almost always it would result into economic turmoils or economic collapse. And so the idea of neoliberalism is to shift the control of the public ownership or publicly owned corporations and other publicly owned companies into the private hands, and let the private institutions and private industry manage the sector. The free market reforms can lead to significant benefits. Let's say, for example, increase in trade and inward investment can play an important role in increasing real wages, job creation, and economic growth. Benefits that accrue to different levels of the income scale. Many of those countries who adopted free market capitalism are actually dominating in the world today. And those who are very nationalistic in their economic concept are actually struggling, in the sense that if you will not open the economy for private ownership, and the government will monopolize the entire services that are provided for the people, the tendency is there will be a skewed growth wherein all of those that wish to develop and prosper will be hindered by a very strong competitor that is backed up by government powers. In this neoliberalism principles, it is opposed to government regulations. You know why? Because government regulations can become over-bureaucratic and inefficient. This is a problem with non-liberalist perspective. There is so much bureaucracy in the government. And so that's the reason why neoliberalists actually believe that reduction or reducing regulation can lead to more efficient allocation of resources, which would of course result into a more progressive economy. This specifically means that neoliberalism would free the people from the bondage of a national control, wherein the government controls everything. And so by putting private hands in the economy, it would increase job creation and economic growth because no one will now control the number of corporations and companies that will compete in a particular market segment or in a particular service. And so this would create jobs and would bolster economic growth. And privatization actually have positive impact on publicly owned corporation turned into private companies. There have been a lot of corporations that were owned publicly by governments in the United States as well as in Russia during the fall of the Soviet Union. But after the privatization, they were able to provide more competitive services as well as more economic gains and efficiency. That's because of privatization. Because privatization actually encourages the owners and investors to work more in order to gain more. Because liberalism, neoliberalism in this particular instance, believe that if you work harder, you will reap the fruits of your labor. But neoliberalism is not a perfect economic regime or economic principle. That's the reason why there are oppositions to neoliberalism. And these are the most famous oppositions. Number one, we have monopolies. Of course, when there is privatization, there is a probability also that those who are rich will continuously enrich themselves and thereby creating monopolies in certain market segments. There is increased financial capabilities, and together with increased financial capabilities, there is a tendency of financial meltdown wherein the flow of money all throughout the world is so huge in the sense that when there is a disruption in the flow of money all throughout the world, there will be a domino effect that will eventually destabilize economies all throughout the world. One of the best examples of that is the economic crisis during the 2008 fall of the Lehman Brothers in the United States that created a domino effect worldwide and wiped out significant amount of wealth in the entire globe. The next thing is globalization. Of course, globalization is a good thing in general, but there are bad side of globalization because in each progress and change, there are winners and losers. And globalization is bad for the losers, especially in the third world countries where they are subjected into some kind of oppression, or not oppression in the sense, but some kind of opportunistic perspective wherein people are actually not given what is due to them. And there is rapid or rampant inequality between the rich and the poor. The rich are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer. That is the attack against neoliberalism. But the idea of neoliberalism, of course, is within the idea that if you work harder and smarter, you will get out of poverty. And so, while it is true that inequality exists, there is also a possibility that you can get out of that imbalanced society because of neoliberalist perspective. Because in the nationalist perspective, wherein all of the industry are controlled by the government, all you need are provided by the government, with the fact that you cannot be as rich as you can, because the government will also regulate your income. Well, there is no point of working harder because at the end of the day, the government will control your wealth creation. And so that's the reason why neoliberalism came into rise, most especially in the middle of 1980s when Ronald Reagan was the president of the United States. So the policies of Ronald Reagan in the United States and Thatcher in the United Kingdom during the 1980s are considered a neoliberal underpinning because they sought to privatize state-owned industries, cut income taxes, and reduce government regulation. Though in practice, extensive government intervention are still present in the economy, the fact is cutting taxes and reducing government regulation actually empowers the private sector to help the government in poverty alleviation and creating programs that would at some point balance the distribution of wealth. Then we have Russia post-communism. When the Soviet Union collapsed in the early 1990s, there was a massive breakup of the Soviet Union, where the Russian economy saw a widespread price deregulation and privatization. The program of privatization was controversial as some become very wealthy overnight. Yes, this is true. But if you look at Russia today in comparison to the Soviet Union, where they adopted a socialist perspective, Russia today is way richer and way better than the Soviet era, just because of price deregulation and privatization. The good side of neoliberalism is that each person will be given the opportunity to grow at your own pace. Although the bad side of neoliberalism is that anyone who has the power to control certain portions of an economic or market segment will have a rapid increase of wealth beyond imagination. In fact, in the United States, we can observe that Jeff Bezos, the CEO of Amazon, actually tripled and quadrupled his wealth in just a matter of 12 months, in just a matter of 6 months. Jeff Bezos can earn up to 2-3 billion in just a matter of one day and one trading day in the New York Stock Exchange. That is, of course, because of neoliberalism. And so there are bad side and good side of neoliberalism. Both parties and both perspectives have a basis in order to forward certain arguments. But at the end of the day, it's a matter of how the people adjust into this particular perspective. Either you are a neoliberalist or a nationalist, or you are a socialist or a capitalist. At the end of the day, what would matter is you have adopted or supported a kind of a global perspective, an economic principle that would lead to prosperity, wherein everyone will be given the chance to prosper for themselves and increase the opportunity to prosper. Now we will try to understand the economics of the rich versus the poor. While it is true that rich are becoming richer and the poor are becoming poorer, in the wider perspective, we can actually observe that not only the poor are becoming poorer, and not only the rich are becoming richer, some rich people are becoming poorer, and some poor people are also becoming richer. There is also a balance into that. And so in creating the balance of perspective in these things, it's not the rich getting richer and the poor getting poorer alone. Some poor are getting rich and some rich are getting poorer. That's the reality that we can observe in the world. While it is true that there are only around 2,825 billionaires in the world, as to the population of 7 billion, that is pretty much less than 0.001% of the world population. Yes, that is correct, because in the world of stiff and harsh competition, not everyone can become a billionaire, of course. In 2018, there are around 2,604 billionaires in the world. That is according to the market research of the firm Wealthex, as reported in CNBC in January 30 of 2020. And the total billionaires' net worth combined was worth at $9.4 trillion. This is an immense amount of money, but it doesn't mean anything. Of course, that is a natural tendency of the world being a free market economy, wherein those who aspire for more can get more if you work hard doing it. Forbes magazine billionaire counts by country provides that the United States is leading, because the United States adopt the free market economy in which the left, the socialist movement in the United States today is trying to change the perspective of the American economic landscape into some kind of a socialist perspective wherein there is greater government control and making government resources focused on social programs, making privately owned companies into public control and government control. So we have United States billionaires at around 614 people. You have China at 389 billionaires, Germany at 107, India at 102, Russia at 109, and Hong Kong at 66, Brazil and the United Kingdom at 45. So they are becoming richer and richer. In fact, the richest man in the world is Jeff Bezos at around $130 billion in net worth. Of course, it changes from time to time based on how the market reacts, because ownership of particular corporations listed in the stock exchange changes from time to time depending on the volume of the shares being traded on a particular day. When there is a drop in the price per share, there is also a drop in the billionaire's net worth. Next, we have, in comparison to the rich, the poor. And the poor are becoming poorer. That's a reality. In the same report of the CNBC, quoting the Bloomberg Business Week, there are 1.5 billion adults in the world that have a net worth of $1,000 or less. In the Philippines, $1,000 is equivalent to 50,000 pesos, which is absolutely correct because more than one half of the Filipinos actually don't have $1,000 in net worth. So, majority of the Filipinos belong to 1.5 billion adults in the world that have less than $1,000 in net worth. Looking at the World Bank figures as of 2015, the most recent estimate, 10% of the global population, or 734 million people, live below the poverty line on the international scale, or less than $1.90 per day. In the Philippines, $1.90 is around 90 pesos. If you earn less than 90 pesos per day, you belong to the definition of what poor in the context of the world is. And so if you have an earning of more than 90 pesos a day, you are not poor in the context of the world. Because if you're earning 90 pesos per day or $1.90 per day, you are in effect richer than 734 million people in the entire world. How amazing is that? Well, that's the reality. Although in the recent decades, the population living below the international poverty line have been shrinking, in the 1990s it was 36%, or the total of 1.9 billion people in the world are actually living below the poverty line, and now is already 734 million people. Although unfortunately there is a challenge of the pandemic that would certainly hurt these people belonging to the poor sector of the entire globe, and they will be hit hard of this pandemic. We will be hoping that there will be recovery after this tragic event in our decade, this tragic event in our life. Now, many people, when talking about rich and the poor, are pointing at each other on who is at fault. Who is at fault? Why is it that there are a lot of people who are poor? Why is it that there are countries who are less developed? Who is the entity that is causing this massive widespread of poverty all throughout the world? Many blames the rich, but others also blames the poor. Many blames the government. But do you know who is to blame In this particular case, it's everyone. You know why? Because we have seen poor getting rich by working hard and smart. But some aren't doing that. Hence, they remain poor. We have seen billionaires spending their billions to help the poor. But some aren't doing that. In fact, many continuously oppress the poor. We have seen the government implement programs that alleviates poverty in the countryside. But some government just don't care about that. This statement is at some point controversial, but that is the reality. If we keep on pointing each of the fragment of our society as they being the fault, as they being the reason of our discomfort, as they being the reason of our disadvantage, and us without working so hard with a smart perspective, we will not be able to progress forward. The rich are becoming richer, the poor are becoming poorer, and the government is indifferent to change. The only thing that you have to do for yourself is not to stay where you are. You have to work hard. You have to increase and multiply that effort that is being done by the family around you and you yourself. Because when you choose to be contented of where you are, time will come, you will also blame the other person instead of blaming yourself. We have the capacity to grow. We have the capacity to increase what we have. We have the capacity to be rich if you want to become rich. You have the capacity to be happy. But if you decide to stay where you are, in that discomfort that you are feeling, then it's up to you. It's not anybody else's fault. It's your fault. And so you have to work harder. You have to do your best to make your life better. Whatever economic principles are adopted in your government, whatever social principles and social programs that have been used and implemented by your government, how may have the rich oppressed you in some instance? At the end of the day, it's your decision to become better and get out into that particular turmoils and disadvantage. It's your decision. And so you have to decide for the better. You have to work hard for the better. Many people don't have the capacity to go to school, but they have worked hard enough that even education is not a hindrance to their success. Because in the modern time, education does not necessarily equate to success. At some point, even if you have a PhD, it doesn't mean that you're successful. Many people who have not gone to school have been very successful. They're very rich. They have helped people in their community. Education does not equate to success. Although it is true also that money does not equate into success. Because at the end of the day, it's how you feel about the way you live and the people around you, and how unity is expressed in the community where you belong, in the family of which you live in. So as a final message in this part 1 of our discussion, decide for yourself. Decide for yourself. Because at the end of the day, it is you who will determine your own destiny. Thank you very much for watching. See you in part 2 of lesson number 2.